Okay. All right, so welcome. My name is Mike Magnuson. I am the librarian in charge of adult programming here at the Hoag Library in Albany, New York. And I'd like to thank you for coming for this program. And I won't leave too much of an introduction. I'm just we'd like to welcome Pat Bono from New York Bee Wellness in Rochester for coming to do this presentation. And I will leave it to you, Pat. Thank you for coming, and go for it.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for everyone here that's listening in. And just a little bit about myself. I've been keeping bees since the mid 1970s, and I have my own apiary. I have my apiary in Wayne County. You'll see pictures of it. I'll talk about it later. But I also have been involved with beekeeping not only locally, forming groups, the Rochester Beekeepers, but on the state level and a little bit on the national level. I started Bee Wellness back in 2011, I believe it was. And that's when we decided to incorporate it and make it into a nonprofit. And we had, I had applied for a USDA grant, a train-to-trainer program. And it's like, how do we reach as many beekeepers as possible in New York State to help them recognize bee disease? And so I devised a train-the-trainer program. We got a 3-year USDA program. And we pretty much train beekeepers from all over New York State and other states too, Massachusetts, Ohio, pretty much everywhere. So I'm doing this presentation today, and I'm just going to cover a lot of different things. And feel free, anyone, ask questions as we go along. So on the title page here,
very quickly, I did forget to mention.
There's the honeycomb, of course. I sell that.
Pat, just 1 second. I forgot to mention, if you have a question, please type it in the chat. I do have everyone muted. But I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and Pat, I will forward questions to you as we get them.
Okay, and just let me know if I'm talking about a slide and it's not advancing. I just got a pop-up that said my internet is unstable. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, so honeybees. Bees actually came about back in the late Mesozoic era, after the Jurassic period, during the Cretaceous period, and this was about 7 million years ago. And it bees kind of developed with wasps, when, of course, with plants, flowering plants. And this is just a chart showing here we are up at the top, more modern times. And we're just working its way down older. So the Cretaceous was the last period in the Mesozoic era. Early Cretaceous amber inclusions included bees or bee-like insects in fossils, different types of bees and nesting bees, burrowing bees during the Mesozoic era. And you can see this is kind of like the same shape of a honeybee today. And through the centuries, bees and mankind have kind of developed, honeybees in particular have developed a relationship. This picture over here in the yellow is an ancient cave painting of a honey gatherer. And these are a type of bees that nest up on cliffs, and they even exist today. But yeah, climbing up on ropes, getting stung by putting the honey in the honey basket. Ancient Egypt revered honeybees, and they kept honeybees in these clay-like cylinders. And here are the hieroglyphs here, honeybees. In the Middle Ages, of course, honey and beeswax were very important. Honey was used to not only as a sweetener, but to make mead, because back then, of course, sanitary conditions were good. Water wasn't really considered sanitary. So beverages like mead were consumed using the honey. And of course, beeswax was used for making candles and so many other things. Of course, the church used a lot of candles. This picture in the upper right here is a woman from about 100 years ago, Edwardian, and she's holding a bee swarm. And I'll talk about more about bee swarms later. But you can see this hive here. Now, the style of hive that we use today has pretty much what we're using for the past 150 years. It's called a Langstroth hive. And that's when they, about 150 years ago, was when they discovered such a thing as bee space, which is about 5/8 of an inch. It's the space that a bee can safely walk through. If it's too big, they want to fill that space up. If it's too small, they can't pass through. In World War II, of course, they had victory gardens, and beekeeping became very popular then because there was sugar rationing. And there was also a need for honey and beeswax because of the sugar rationing. And the beeswax was actually used in various munitions, waterproofing, that sort of thing. Okay, let's get to the honeybee. So here's our cute little honeybee here. They are insects. They have two sets of wings. So this looks like one wing, but it's actually two wings that are kind of like, think of it as almost like a feather. There's little hooks between the two wings that hold them together, and it helps them maneuver a lot better when they fly. They are pollinators. They are dependent on plants, flowering plants. Without flowering plants, they could not exist. They are essentially vegetarians. Honeybees are cavity nesters, which means they really rarely will nest in the ground. Of course, think of the trees, empty trees, cavities in trees, people's attics, or any other hollow space that the bees think are a good place to spend their winter. They do increase or swarm mainly in the late spring. And right now I'll talk about more about swarms later, but we're approaching peak swarm season in the Rochester area. Hives usually have just one queen, and she can lay over 1,000 eggs a day. And the honeybees do overwinter in clusters. And that is the reason why honeybees collect so much honey, produce so much honey, because here again, they're dependent on flowers. In the winter, no flowers. So they need to store as much food as they can, because honeybees have some of the biggest colonies. Average mature hive at the height of summer would be about 40,000 or even more bees. And they go into winter with maybe just a little bit fewer, but all these bees. Okay, here's a diagram of the body parts of a honeybee. It's 3 body parts. You have the head with their antenna, which is a sensory organ. They have these big compound eyes, and they even have these tiny little eyes called ocelli, which is similar to what spiders have, these accessory eyes. They have fairly weak jaws, whereas wasps have very strong jaws because they're meat eaters, fairly weak jaws, and they have a very long tongue, not as long as, say, a butterfly, and it's like a straw-like tongue, and this is how they sip up the nectar. They have 6 legs. This shows 3 on one side, and they're called tarsi. And what's important about the back leg is it's so much wider. It's almost like a paddle. And this is where they, when they go to flowers to collect pollen, they pack it all on the back of their hind leg. It's called the pollen basket. The center part of their body is a thorax, and this is where mainly all their muscle is. So the wings and the legs are attached to the thorax, where most of the muscle is. And the third part of their body is the abdomen. Of course, that's where all their digestive organs are. And the stinger, of course, is at the very end. And they breathe through these little holes. They're called spiracles. Okay, here are the members of a beehive. This is the queen bee. And you can see and this is, all these are pretty much to scale in size, but you could see how much longer her abdomen is, and that's where all the ovaries are. And remember, she's laying up to 1,000 eggs a day. So yeah, she it's a very long body. The drone, there's about 10% male bees in the hive. They do not sting. Instead of a stinger, they have a phallus. They have huge eyes, and they really, and look how it's like they're wearing a fur coat, and they're the second biggest bee in the hive, and they really don't do anything. Their only purpose is to mate with queens when there's a swarm or whenever it's needed. But they're pretty much pampered by the other bees. They're fed, but unfortunately, in the fall when things get tight, the flowers aren't producing nectar anymore. Most of the drones are kicked out of the hive to die, and they're actually dragged out. Here's the worker bee, and these are still females. And of course they have stingers, but these are the workers. They do all the work in the hive, and they attend to both the queens and the drones. And there's the stinger. This is the comb that the bees make, and this is the egg that a queen would lay. It hatches at 3 days and becomes a larva, and I'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. And then it's sealed over and pupates, and within from when the egg is Varroa mite. This is the parasite of the honeybee, and this is why we're having so much problems keeping bees alive, honeybees alive, is because of this invasive parasite. And this down here is just a small hive beetle, and they're a pest. When they get into the hive, they eat the pollen that the bees have collected, and then they lay their larva, and it creates a really ugly mess. So they're just pests. Okay, honeybees undergo what's called metamorphosis. Starts with eggs, become larvae, they pupate and go into adult. Here it shows the queen laying the egg. It's another reason for her long abdomen. She can reach down and lay the egg right at the base. It hatches, the larva is formed, and this is a nurse bee. And the nurse bee is feeding the larva until it gets big, really big. And then they seal up the larva and let it spin its cocoon and pupate. And then, of course, it emerges. And here you can see a close to the egg and the larva. Now, this is when the nurse bees feed the larva, they're in like a pool. It's not royal jelly, it's worker jelly. Unless they're making a queen, the queen would have royal jelly, which just has a lot more nutrients. But all the larvae float in this worker jelly that the nurse bees feed it. And this is a drone emerging from the cell. So I'm going to give you an example of a butterfly. They lay an egg, of course, on milkweed. That hatches, forms a caterpillar. Now, what's different than the honeybee is the caterpillar are on their own, whereas the larval form of the honeybee needs to be fed. The caterpillar eats on its own, and so yeah, the larva form is where it really needs to eat a lot and a lot. Think of the hungry caterpillar, and a butterfly will form what's called the chrysalis, which is outside. It's not in a hive; it's just out in the open by the milkweed. Whereas the honeybee will spin its cocoon inside the cell. So, and then it hatches and forms a butterfly. So the honeybees are actually dependent on each other. So it's a society, each one has a role. So this shows that, say, after 21 days, a honeybee emerges from her cell. Her first job is to clean out her honeycomb where she emerged, because this gives a space for the queen to lay another egg. Remember, it's numbers game, 1,000 eggs a day, and during the height of summer, they need all the space they can get. At about 1 week, she develops where she can feed the larva herself, even though she's just emerged. So she's a nurse bee, and she gives that jelly to the larva. When they get older, they can build honeycomb because they can produce wax on their bodies. And this, the wax is actually excreted underneath their abdomen. It comes out in flakes, and they actually take the flakes and they will form the perfect hexagon for the cells in the honeycomb. As they get older, they start receiving the food from incoming foragers, such as nectar or pollen, and they will store it in the cells that they've made. Then they become guard bees. And here their stingers are well developed and they guard the entrance of the hive. And the beehive is actually a vast treasure that needs to be protected, because even though they have thousands of bees, they have all these resources in the hive. They have all this honey, all this nectar, all this pollen, all these young larvae, all these young bees, and they can be, there's a lot of predators that would love, whether big like bears or small like wasps, that will want to take advantage of this huge treasure of resources and get in there. So they need to guard the hive. And then they also remove any dead bodies from the hive. And then finally, at about 3 weeks, they graduate to becoming a forager. And what they do is they orient outside their hive, their location, where their hive is, and then they start venturing out, going for nectar, pollen, or water. And then, of course, they die after about 6 weeks during the summertime. So here again, the biggest threat to the honeybee population is the parasite called the Varroa mite. It's called the Varroa destructor. It breeds on developing young bees and spread viruses. So it's kind of like a tick-like parasite, and like ticks, they spread viruses. So what happens is the Varroa mites go on the nurse bees, and when the larvae of the nurse bees are ready to pupate, the Varroa mite sneaks in there just as the cell is being sealed, and she starts laying eggs, and she has a whole breeding cycle inside the cell. So one mite might go into a cell with a larva, and several will come out. Pesticides are an issue. If you want to use pesticides, please follow the label instructions. Do not spray when a plant is flowering, and this is not just for honeybees, but also other pollinators. If a plant is flowering, something is going to be visiting it. So please don't spray when the plant is flowering, and use only when absolutely necessary. And most pesticides are what are called lipophilic, which means it binds the fats or oils. So it tends not to be in honey. They can be brought back and incorporated into the wax or the pollen, but honey is water-based, so much affected by pesticides. And this just to show, so New York Bee Wellness, my organization, we have our ongoing campaign. It's Fight the Mite. But this is the Varroa mite. It kind of like goes between the plates. Think of a lobster tail. These plates on the abdomen of the bee, and they kind of burrow in there and feed off the bee. And when the time is right, they just drop off where the larvae are. Okay, again, forage for bees is also one of the most important requirements for their basic bee health. Floral sources are needed throughout the growing season, and a variety of flowering plants are necessary for a bee to collect. Pollen is a source of protein for the bee, and this is used to make bee bread and to help feed the developing larvae. So the nurse bees are the ones who eat the bee bread, and then this way they are able to give the larvae their worker jelly. Nectar is used to make honey. Actually, nectar is very watery, whereas honey is a very low moisture product, and that serves as their energy food or their carbohydrate in nutrition. They also collect what's called propolis, and that's a resin from leaf buds, and this is used to coat the inside of a hive like caulking or varnish, and some people think it may have antibacterial properties. So bees and many flowering plants are codependent. Preserving wild open spaces maintains areas of forage for pollinators. And wild plants are preferred by most pollinators, especially honeybees. So the more open wild spaces, not having parks that are mowed frequently, are the best for pollinators. And this just shows these are some hives that I had several years ago during winter. And so they're all clustered in here. Of course, they all have honey stored that they collected during the summer and early fall. And they still have some young bees in here. But here again, what happens when when it gets very cold is they need to have access to the honey to generate warmth. So remember, that's their carbohydrate. They need to consume that carbohydrate to use their muscles, their flight muscles in their thorax to produce warmth in the hive. And this is an example. This is very early spring in a hive. And this is what the cluster looks like. If you were to open up a hive, it's kind of like a ball shape. So they're opening these two parts of the hive, but you see they're all tight together. It gets warm, they break up this cluster and they move around more, but the colder it gets, the tighter the ball gets. And this is just a honeybee out in the snow. That happens. Sometimes they leave the hive, during the summer, the bees live 6 weeks. During the winter, they can live up to 6 months. Okay, this is shows how bees process and store honey. When a field bee arrives at her hive, she transfers the nectar that she collected from a flower to a house bee, tongue to tongue. They have the straw-like tongue. The house bee spreads a droplet of nectar on the roof of the honey cell where the nectar begins to dry. So remember, the nectar has a lot of water content, whereas honey does not. So they have to get rid of that water content or that moisture. During the next couple of days, other house bees fan wings over the honeycomb. Fanning evaporates the moisture in nectar. Finally, other house bees cap the honey cells with a thin layer of wax, which the young bees produce. And inside, the thickened nectar ages and becomes honey. So the bees, essentially, they reduce the moisture and they add enzymes. So honey is actually, does have a lot of complex sugars in it, like sucrose, but the honeybees add enzymes to the nectar to break down these complex sugars into simple sugars like fructose and glucose. Okay, New York State is actually a great nectar producing state. It's not like the giant nectar producing states like in the Dakotas or Montana, which has a very huge crop in a very short amount of time. We do have a lot of great nectar that the bees can collect from because we have a moderate summer. The soil is good. This part of, think about where the Erie Canal is. There's a limestone belt that runs across upstate New York. Rochester is kind of part of that. And also there's good areas up to the St. Lawrence, down the Hudson Valley. And these are some of the best places for honey production. Clover and goldenrod are some of the biggest crops. And these are just natural wild plants. There's so many different clovers out there, wild clovers, and we're in a good location for that. And most honey that is collected and sold locally is wildflower nectar. Here again, bees prefer wildflowers, not so much crops. If given the choice of going to a cultivated crop or a wild area, they will pick the wild area. There is a concern about loss of forage and habitat for these flowers. And just briefly, I'm not going to go over this, but this gives you an idea of the different types of plants that bees really like. Annuals, the clovers, sunflowers, zinnias, perennials, globe thistle, hyacinths. Roses produce some pollen, not so much nectar. Other garden plants, cucumbers, pumpkins, good pollen producers for bees. Anything in the allium family, the garlics, onions, and lavender, mint family, very good. And of course, all the different types of shrubs. Trees, we're going to head into a really great season for honey pretty soon, because a lot of the trees will start blooming, like the black locust. We're waiting for that. And just gives you, whoops, picture. The alliums, of course, up on the left. There's a honeybee on there. Apple blossoms were just past peak with the apple blossom, but we had a tremendous year for apple blossom bloom. We had this really great weather and not much rain. So this was really great for bees. Clover should be starting pretty soon. And there's the black locust tree on the right-hand side. And then, of course, the milkweed will start growing soon, and that produces a lot of nectar for bees, say come end of June. Dandelion is one of the first flowers that the bees really go to. And you can see that honeybee has a pollen pellet on its hind leg. And of course, the goldenrod. And goldenrod is extremely important, and we're in a really good spot for goldenrod up in upstate New York here by Rochester. That is the plant that most pollinators and depend on. You can see there's a wasp in that picture, because that's the last big hurrah before winter is the goldenrod. And of course, goldenrod is one of those plants that nobody grows intentionally. It grows wild, but it's a fantastic honey plant. And this is just me really quick at my apiary, which I'm at right now. And just shows me, the bee veil smoker. I have a hive tool in my hand and with my beehives, and I do use a golf cart because honey is heavy. And this is me lifting up a honey super on a hive. And of course I use the smoker for that. And this is me shaking off the bees. This is a full honey frame. The bees have cured the nectar into honey and sealed it up. And then I bring it back into my barn and put it in an extractor. And it works like a spin cycle on a washing machine. It spins all the honey out after I remove the wax on the surface. And then it's put through a strainer. And here's just a close up of me taking the wax off the cured honey. Again, plants that bloom, we have spring. Different plants are blooming in the spring, then early summer and summer. As this year goes on, the wildflowers vary. And just, this is some of the honey that I bottle, but it just shows a variation in the color. As the year goes on, the honey tends to get darker. So the sweeter honeys are at the beginning of the year when the tree blossoms are blooming. And this is my barn. Actually, I'm here now. I don't know if anyone can hear hammering in the background because they're building a deck on the back of the barn right now. And this is just me, different things. I've in different awards for the honey. I go to different events. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here now and talk about some other bees, wasps. Right now, you're going to be starting to see the Carpenter bees, especially the drones. They're a very big bee. They have the black shiny abdomens, of course, the yellow furry vest. Bumblebees tend to have some very small colonies. Yes, they do have a lot of members here, but compared to a honeybee nest, it's very small. We're kind of past the season for ground or mining bees. A lot of people call up and they get very worried. There's all these bees in the ground, but they're native bees. They're solitary bees, and they really don't sting at all. Whereas of members, they're more disposable, shall we say. Native bees tend not to, because they do have fewer members. They need every member of their cohort there. And here's a close up of the miner bee, the little pencil with opening. Think of it as a bunch of apartment buildings just close together. Now, as far as honeybees go, back in the 80s, there was a big concern because of the movement of Africanized bees, which of course are from South Africa. And they were inadvertently imported into the Western Hemisphere in Brazil. And these are called Africanized, or some people call them killer honeybees. And they are different from the honeybee, slightly different than the honeybee that we have in North America. But they did actually spread. This was our biggest fear. This kind of map ends in 1998. And it really hasn't panned out the way we thought it would. Yes, there are some Africanized bees, say in Florida, Southern California, but here we are in 2021, and it hasn't taken over. They really don't like the cold, but this is what has been on people's mind back in the 70s. In fact, we had all these disaster movies, including that included swarms because of this whole issue of the Africanized bees. So played on people's fears. Here you have, this is Gloria Swanson, bee movie, literally bee movie. All these other strange films. The Swarm was probably the most famous of the disaster swarm hunt bee movies. And they actually got some really top-notch actors. You got Henry Fonda here, Michael Caine, Catherine Ross. I think Shelley Winters was even in this. But they took the whole idea of the Africanized bees and really blew it out of proportion. And yes, it's totally incorrect. In reality, the reality of bee swarms, it's a method of increase for a hive. And this is where the old queen leaves in the spring with about half of the bees in the hive. And what they do is form a bivouac, which is a temporary holding spot on a tree branch or other temporary spot. And this is a pretty big swarm. And you see the bees are just hanging together. And they're waiting for the scout bees to go out and find a location for them to go to. And then they'll leave maybe within hours or within days to the new location. Meanwhile, back at the old hive, the young queens will emerge from their cells after they pupated and go to mate with the drones. So we have, right now, we have a lot of people that are beekeepers that are willing to collect swarms. And I'll show you the page. Rochester Beekeepers has a list of people ready to collect swarms. I just caught a swarm on Saturday, actually, and I took it to the Tinker Nature Center, which is where the Rochester Beekeepers meet, and I added it to their apiary. So I'll go check on it again this weekend. But usually all bee clubs have a swarm collectors list. And this just shows more pictures of swarms. This is a little swarm. There's someone just holding a branch with the swarm on it. And here's that picture again. And these are two women that have a branch with a swarm. So they just take it and shook it into a hive. And this is a page from our website, rochesterbeekeepers.com. And it does, right below here, there's just a long list of people willing to collect swarms. And there's also links on this page too, for different types of bees. You know, are they wasps or are they honeybees? Okay. So these are wasps. Wasps are different than honeybees because they all die in the wintertime except for the queen wasps. They burrow away somewhere or in a tree, and all the other members die. So this is the gray paper wasp nest that's been broken apart, and it takes them all season to make this, whereas honeybees already have their nest unless they swarmed. But they still have a really big population. So unfortunately, it takes all become very sizable. So that's when they become a threat or a problem to a lot of people outdoors. And a lot of people, when they get stung at the end of the year at their picnics or whatever, they say, oh, it's bees. And it's like, no, they're wasps. And I always ask people that want me to come and get them, I ask them, do they have bright yellow on their bodies? If they have bright yellow on their bodies, not honeybees, bright yellow on their bodies, they're wasps. And there's all different types of wasps. This is a wasp. It's called a cicada killer, and it is native to our area. And of course, the cicadas around here, you hear about the brood that's emerging. We're really not going to have them in New York. We did have some brood emerging, a cicada brood a couple years ago, but there's this big brood emerging south of New York of the cicadas. And around here, the cicadas really don't start until it gets very hot. The ground generally say mid-June, end of July, usually about 4th of July, you could hear the cicadas in the trees. But there is a wasp. This is a queen, a cicada killer, and she has to be very big to catch these cicadas. That is her prey. Now, many of you have heard about the Asian giant hornet, AKA the murder hornet, and you can see how big it is. Now, a queen cicada killer is almost the same size, but unlike, and look at the jaws, they have strong jaws. Look how big that is. Imagine being bit by that. Unfortunately, there's only incidences in British Columbia and Washington State. It's unknown whether they will ever make it to New York State or not. But if people do see something that looks like that, has like a hockey mask type look to it, and it is huge. Look at this guy holding it. You can report it to the master gardeners at Cooperative Extension or Ag and Markets. But this just shows all the different types of wasps there are. Here's the little honeybee in comparison. You got the bumblebees, just different types. Okay, beekeeping would probably be a lot more popular. Except for the fact that they do need to protect their nest with all the resources in it. And this is a close-up of a bee that has just stung someone. Now the stinger is a barbed stinger. Think of a fish hook. It is attached to the innards of the honeybee. So when a honeybee stings, the barbs hold the stinger in place and is pulled out. The bee moves away and it just pulls out from the honeybee, and she will die. But also there's a venom sac on here. So if you do get stung, you just need to scrape this off. Don't try using tweezers or plucking it out, or just scrape it off because you don't want to squeeze any more from the honey sac into your skin. Queen bees actually have smooth stingers, but and they can sting several times, but they usually use them only on other queen bees. Wasps, of course, have smooth stingers and they can sting again and again, whereas the honey bees, they die. They only sting once. Always be aware of that. Some people may have an alert where epinephrine is needed. It is an emergency situation. If someone is truly allergic to venom, whether it be from honeybees or other insects or animals, you need to call 911 if they have problems breathing, develop a rash, call 911 first, and then so this way helps on the way. And then they have an epinephrine pen that can be used. You can use meat tenderizer or Benadryl. If you will get stung and it starts to swell a little bit, do not scratch it because that causes a more of inflammatory response. And approach bees calmly and slowly. Quick actions, movements will agitate not only animals, but insects too. Okay, and I just want to go over New York Bee Wellness again. It is an independent grassroots 501c3 organization, and we do conduct 2 surveys a year to assess bee disease, colony loss, This winter wasn't the best as far as colony loss goes. We've had better years, but not too bad. We do have an educational website. We do hands-on training workshops on bee disease. Of course, we've been doing a lot of Zoom instead of that this past year. We do national webinars, and these webinars are recorded and on our YouTube site. So please visit, if you're interested, please visit our YouTube site. We have a lot of interesting lectures, webinars, some hands-on, and we've trained so many beekeepers over the years. And these are just a bunch of resources, links, rochesterbeekeepers.com, very important. If people are interested, please contact me. I could send you this information. And that's it. So please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you very much for listening.